Hey, welcome to Crossroads. In today's episode, we'll be talking about how the government right now is being accused of flagging purchases that had keywords such as Trump or MAGA, meaning if you were using them in some of your purchases, you may have been labeled possibly an extremist and maybe even investigated as a terrorist. And this even included tags on some religious books. Also, the Biden administration had terror designators tied to these. Let me explain. All right, folks, the federal government allegedly flagged online purchases and payments for potential terrorism and extremism. And this included any searches for keywords like Trump or MAGA. And it even extended to purchases of religious books. Representative Jim Jordan of the House Judiciary Committee and also through the Weaponization of Government Committee issued a letter detailing the allegations on political and religious surveillance allegedly being carried out right now as we speak. Let me show you what he said on X. He wrote, "We now know the federal government flagged terms like MAGA and Trump to financial institutions if Americans completed transactions with those terms." He says, what was flagged? What was also flagged? If you bought a religious text like a Bible or shopped at Bass Pro Shop. Are you understanding that, folks? If you bought a Bible, if you purchased a Bible, the Biden administration may have labeled you as an extremist or investigated you as a terrorist. And it included if you happen to have shopped at Bass Pro. If you shopped at Bass Pro, you might have also gotten labeled. Now, this is part of the congressional investigation into the Biden administration's weaponization of the federal government. And the concern is that the Biden admin has been using the arms of government to target his political enemies and the political enemies of the Democrats overall. The congressional committee, the one now looking into this, they're currently calling on Noah Bischoff to testify before Congress. Noah Bischoff is the former director of the Office of Stakeholder Integration and Engagement, and that's in the Strategic Operations Division of the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, also known as FinCEN. Let me show you the actual letter where they're calling him in to testify. Because in this letter, they detail some of what we've been discussing, some of the actions the federal government was allegedly carrying out where they were monitoring payments like all of these. This is the actual congressional letter, and it says this. It says the committee and select subcommittee, that's again the House Judiciary Committee and its subcommittee on the weaponization of the federal government, have obtained documents indicating that following January 6, 2021, FinCEN distributed materials to financial institutions that, among other things, outline the typologies, quote unquote, of various persons of interest and provide financial institutions with suggested terms and merchant category codes, or MCCs, for identifying transactions on behalf of the federal government. In other words, the federal government gave different financial institutions, we can assume these are maybe credit card companies or something else because we have seen examples of this, handed these off to these financial institutions and gave them keywords that they should flag for potential extremism or terrorism. And it notes, quote, "These materials included a document recommending the use of generic terms like Trump and MAGA, as in Make America Great Again, to search Zelle payment messages, as well as prior FinCEN analysis of lone wolf actor, homegrown violent extremism indicators." In other words, if you're a suspected terrorist, someone who might carry out an act of terrorism. The letter says that according to the analysis, FinCEN warned, this is again FinCEN, which is the federal government, warned financial institutions of extremism indicators that include transportation charges such as bus tickets, rental cars or plane tickets, or travel to areas with no apparent purpose, or the purchase of books, including religious texts. And again, Representative Jim Jordan is saying that included the Bible, and also subscriptions to other media containing extremist views. Look, in other words, it says FinCEN urged large financial institutions to comb through the private transactions of their customers for suspicious charges on the basis of political and religious expression. So what does this mean? This means the federal government, using FinCEN, had flagged support for the President of the United States, Donald J. Trump. Because remember, he was still president on January 6th. And this was flagged as an indicator of terrorism or extremism. And this included anybody who supported MAGA or Trump. Maybe if you bought a MAGA hat, or if you bought like a Trump 2024 t-shirt or anything like that, those keywords related to that could have been flagged. Or, for example, if you bought a religious book, if you purchased a Bible, well, it's for some reason they say that, well, if you buy a Bible, you might just be an extremist because for some reason they labeled the President of the United States at the time, Donald J. Trump, as an indicator for terrorism or extremism. And it also flagged subscriptions to other media containing extremist views. And look, given how broad the term extremist is being applied, the concern for that is that this could have included people just subscribing to independent news channels. Maybe, who knows, maybe I'm included on that for all we know. Now look, if this is true, if, again, you know, right now they're going to call this guy in to testify, the head of FinCEN. If it's true the Biden administration was actually doing this, this would mean the federal government may be violating basic constitutional rights, yet again, of Americans on their political views and on their religious beliefs. That would be deeply illegal on both sides of it. We probably wouldn't see anybody go to jail with it, but at the very least we could see some maybe new regulations coming about to make sure this doesn't happen further. It is possible there will be some criminal charges. I'll explain that in a minute. But basically, currently, we'll get into that. This would fit into the bigger picture of what we see in the Biden administration doing elsewhere. You might remember we showed you, training slides from the U.S. military after Biden came into office that labeled evangelical Christians as extremists. We saw other materials in the Biden administration that labeled Catholics as extremists, and there's a lot more to it. Now let me show you. This is page 2 of the document where they're requesting this guy to come in and testify, the head of FinCEN, or the former head. And this document on page 2 states, in addition, the committee and select subcommittee have obtained documents showing that FinCEN distributed slides prepared by a financial institution explaining how other financial institutions can use MCC codes. Those are the things that will sound an alarm. If there's a keyword attached to a purchase, that'll sound an alarm and flag it. MAGA, Trump, a Bible. Those are the codes that'll be used to say this person might be an extremist. Maybe they're going to be a terrorist. And it says that they recommended the use of these MCC codes to detect customers whose transactions may reflect, quote, potential active shooters and who may include dangerous international terrorists, domestic terrorists, homegrown violent extremists, aka lone wolves. In other words, they were suggesting that maybe Trump supporters were just going to be terrorists. And remember the way they were flagging the entire J6 event as being an act of insurrection. That included just about anybody who supported the President of the United States at the time. It notes that, for example, these slides that were used to instruct these institutions, the slides instruct financial institutions to query for transactions using certain MCC codes, such as, for example, because remember we said that they have these codes, 3484 referred to small arms, meaning you bought a firearm. 5091 referred to sporting and recreational goods and supplies. You getting that? Briefly on that, there have been mainstream media articles suggesting that canning your food or pickling or buying surplus of goods in case there's a disaster, that these are all indicators of a potential extremist. And so, grandma canning her pickles in the garage or whatever like that may be labeled as an extremist. And it's interesting they had this designator 5091 sporting and recreational goods and supplies. It also included keywords such as Cabela's and Dick's Sporting Goods. Getting that, folks. among others, it says. And it notes that despite these transactions having no apparent criminal nexus, who would think that shopping at Dick's Sporting Goods could get you labeled as a terrorist, right? Despite this, it says, in fact, this relate to Americans exercising their Second Amendment rights, meaning, our rights to bear arms, a right that shall not be infringed, as stated in the Constitution, which defines the limits of how much government can do whatever the heck they want to us. They cannot infringe upon our rights to own firearms. FinCEN, it says, seems to have adopted a characterization. Remember, FinCEN would be the representative of the American government in this case. This is a government agency. It says it seems to have adopted a characterization of these Americans, Trump supporters, as potential threat actors, and of course religious believers in this case. It says this kind of pervasive financial surveillance carried out in coordination with and at the request of federal law enforcement into Americans' private transactions is alarming and raises serious doubts about FinCEN's respect for fundamental civil liberties. Now, basically what happened here, as far as, again, we're going to get more answers on it. This guy hasn't testified before Congress yet. Presumably, we're going to be learning a lot more. But basically, this used terrorism and extremist labels to surveil, monitor for any indicators of a Trump supporter. And it was looking at what you were buying online. If you used Zelle payments, which is like a digital payment system, if you were buying stuff on the internet, if you purchased certain things that could have gotten flagged, and the federal government would have gotten an alert suggesting that you're a potential terrorist, you're a potential lone wolf extremist, or whatever else. And it appears to have included systems to monitor the purchases of guns or ammunition, which would, of course, violate basic principles under the Second Amendment. Now, look, Congress right now, under the Congressional Judicial Committee and under the Weaponization of Government Committee, they're investigating it. They're looking into this and also the bigger picture, and we're very likely going to learn a whole lot more once this guy goes to testify, the former head of FinCEN. And aside from Congress looking into this, we could also expect possible criminal investigations. I mentioned, we'll see if anybody gets convicted or, charged for this, which I would regard this as a crime committed by the government. I would personally regard this as the government persecuting people based on their religion or, using the arms of government to target their political enemies. I don't think that should be legal in the United States for the federal government to do. We'll see if there's any charges on it, but the Missouri Attorney General, that's Andrew Bailey, he is suggesting, at least on Twitter or X, that he's going to look into this. And again, if it's the Attorney General, presumably this is going to be looking into any criminal violations on behalf of the federal government or people tied in with it. Maybe even the financial institutions. It would be easier for them to go after the financial institutions, whatever they were, who were involved in this type of operation, working with the government to flag patriotic Americans as terrorists. And Attorney General Andrew Bailey wrote this. He said, "Thanks for the great work on this, Jim Jordan," again, head of the Judicial Committee. And he says, "and weaponization," referring to the committee to investigate the weaponization of the federal government. And Bailey says, "My team is looking into this matter. Missourians will not be penalized for their political beliefs, not on my watch." Again, suggesting they're going to be launching a criminal investigation to see if any crimes were violated through these actions. Now, look, of course, some of this was already known. We knew, for example, that credit card companies were reporting on purchases that anybody made in Washington on January 6th. And they were using, if you were in Washington, D.C. on January 6th and you used your credit card, that was flagged to let them know who was there that day. Now, that said, this also raises concerns over things like digital currencies and what it means if all of our transactions are monitored by the government or by woke corporations. Now, look, what we're being told is that this type of system, digital payments and so on, they won't be used politically. But already we're seeing that credit card payments were being monitored politically. We're seeing that Zelle payments, which would be a digital currency, or something like that, were being monitored politically. And in light of this, well, we're wondering what the heck, what if they launch these CBDCs, these centralized bank digital currencies? Will these banks, these financial institutions, carry out the same type of action to punish us? If we want to buy stuff from Dick's Sporting Goods, or you buy a Bible, or you buy, a campaign jersey for, your president of choice. Trump recently said in New Hampshire that he is not going to allow the creation of a central bank digital currency because of this. Let me show you what he said.
Tonight, I'm also making another promise to protect Americans from government tyranny. As your president, I will never allow the creation of a central bank digital currency. You know about that? Such a currency would give a federal government, our federal government, the absolute control over your money. They could take your money, you wouldn't even know it was gone. This would be a dangerous threat to freedom, and I will stop it from coming to America.
Now look, in addition to this, because we're talking about, payments related to the day of January 6th, it's been 3 years since the events of J6 at the Capitol, but the Department of Justice, right now as we speak, is still going after Americans for it. You would think that the initial rounds of arrests, that was it. Well, no, that's not it. People are still having their doors kicked down by federal authorities at, pre-dawn raids. People are still being dragged off and thrown in the gulag. People are still being thrown in solitary confinement for years while they await trial. They're still being dragged before a packed court of people who already have pre-existing notions about the case. And yes, in many cases, their political views, for example, if they express support for the President of the United States at the time, Donald Trump, that is being used against them in the court of law. The arrests are ongoing. And not only that, the Biden administration is now suggesting that it's going to broaden the number of people it will target, the number of Americans who were there that day. And they're going to be going after, it seems, or they're suggesting, even Americans who did not enter the Capitol building. Because, so far, for the most part, there have been some cases otherwise, but for the most part, the people being dragged off to the gulag, it's only, again, there's some exceptions to this, but for the most part, only the people who entered the building or broke windows or whatever else. Actually, they're not really going after those ones. Mostly just the people who, paraded and walked through the building. Mostly those people. But now, if you were outside the building, if you were trespassing on Capitol grounds, you could be arrested now, and they're suggesting it. I'll be talking about this part only on Epoch TV, though. J6, YouTube will censor me for talking about it too much. So join me on Epoch TV, where we can talk about real news, unlike a lot of these censored platforms. The link to that is in the description below. That's EpochTV.com. And also, speaking of banned news, we have a new documentary out, The Real Story of January 6th, Part 2. This is deeply important. I have Part 1 and Part 2 only on Epoch TV. We have a lot of unreleased video footage. We went through countless hours, investigations, watching unreleased footage. Again, Epoch Times is one of only 3 media that was given access by Congress to these videos. Let me show you the trailer of this before we jump over.
Calling the January 6th investigation the biggest investigation in FBI history.
There are more than 1,100 arrests, and they show no signs of slowing down.
When you take an oath, you have to abide by it.
They're just going to identify you on video, arrest you, and then figure out what the evidence is after that.
Those involved must be held accountable.
He's an innocent man. And he has been punished for something that he never did. Every day you wake up and you're like, how did I get out of bed today?
You have to stay away from the word patriot now because that's a terrorist organization.
We interviewed 2 whistleblowers from the FBI.
I sacrificed my dream job to share this information with the American people.
That siege was criminal behavior, plain and simple, and it's behavior that we, the FBI, view as domestic terrorism.
We started with death threats, the hate mail, I don't care what they do to me, but I do care what they do to my family.
Our family struggles every day.
And it's going to change narratives no matter what your political perspective is.